In August 1985, John Mellencamp released Scarecrow, a protest album against suburban encroachment on rural farmland, such as that lost to those close to him. With songs such as Rain on the Scarecrow and Face of the Nation, he expressed anger at the loss of local farmlands and how he perceived the country was changing. The album was the culmination of a growing awareness of the suburban condition and its negative impact on the American landscape. It's okay to live in a small town, he says. Suspicion toward the cheap pink houses and strip malls ruining the once beautiful, and more importantly, functional landscape, with the ending of dense small-town urbanism in favor of plastic, car-centric suburban development. Joining the likes of Willie Nelson and Neil Young, he became a founding member of Farm Aid, a benefit for struggling American farmers. Meanwhile, in his struggle between his largely agrarian cultural background, urbanist awareness, and the ambivalence from most around him, he became a self-described liberal. But with such ambivalence from all sides, what does it mean to be an urbanist? This is where I start to question the pathologies of the suburban identity. With only 7 years of awareness of this issue, the most puzzling thing to me is not the ambivalence toward the built environment from hardworking lay people, but from supposedly educated and well-traveled individuals, lawmakers, politicians, even planners and architects who seem completely unaware and in denial of the suburban lock-in, despite overwhelming scientific evidence to how it and bad planning causes the social unrest we see around us. And it's such a big and ignored problem, I'm beginning to understand Jim Kunstler's pessimism. With unprecedented authoritarian corporate control of the American human habitat, the ambivalence from everybody in the country would seem to be human-planned, without a study of human cognition. Among my first awareness of American attitudes of the city was a scene I experienced, sitting on a rooftop in Seoul reading a book, a woman hanging her clothes on the clothesline on the rooftop. This was a very peaceful setting, but being American and largely unexperienced with urban settings, thoughts came to my head. The scene of a person hanging their clothes on a city rooftop cries Harlem and conjures violent memories, a clear discord from the peaceful moment that I was experiencing. I became more aware over time. America is anti-urban. But where did this attitude come from? Through further experience, it became clear that when I stare at the foreign face that enters the diner, it doesn't just arrive from a mist of fiery evil within the human, but culminates through psychological processes so powerful that the self-aware can't even prevent it. And it exists within every human being on the planet, and is further perpetuated by separation. But where does this separation of people in the American habitat come from? I believe the current narrative of white flight as a total cause to the current landscape is overly asserted, and there is much more nuance to how it happened. When pieced together, it would better help us understand current American attitudes outside of racism that perpetuate sprawl. As people fight over race in America, they sit in deference to corporate control of every facet of the American landscape, including their own backyards. To say that the works of America's most influential architects, those such as Le Corbusier and Frank Lloyd Wright, is purely fueled by racism is not only reductive, but ignores other parts of culture, life events, and thoughts that affect people from the environment. The narrative of white flight, while true to a certain degree, is overly asserted as a cause to suburban sprawl. When cities were abandoned, what's with the architecture they embraced? Why did it evolve the way that it did, and why was even the small town abandoned? If you look at Le Corbusier and Wright's work, they are very similar in a lot of regards. Le Corbusier thought that where order reigns, well-being begins. He admired early forms of zoning and planning. His prerogative became increasing space while concentrating people via towers in the park. Frank Lloyd Wright's Broadacre City is extremely similar, with its square blocks lined with bushes and trees, denoting order of not only city life, but a growing agrarian ideal of taming nature. Order of everything and everyone. This is the beginning of the authoritarian design that started restricting people from participation in the city. With communities disarmed, the money interests began to take hold, with people oblivious and powerless to stop it. There's nothing more square than to tell somebody to participate in their community, but to let them. As traditional urban architecture became more and more rejected by the suburban population, it's possible the Black urban label began to grow in association with the largely Black and Hispanic populations that remained among the architecture. It's curious to note as time went on that the younger generation, the baby boomers growing up in gridded streetcar suburbs, grew to resent the small and utterly useless lawns that they were often not allowed to play on. They moved further out to newly designed exurban McMansions with much larger lawns, making greater space between people in the communities. These same people who feared the competition of the city now complain about such things as participation awards. This is just one very small example of bad planning for human needs in the early streetcar suburbs. As another personal anecdote, walking in Manila with some local friends, the American embassy was pointed at. There it sat occupying the edge of the bay and blocking it from local access, most likely the only building in the city with a lawn surrounding it. "It's the biggest building in Manila," he said, "and yet we never get to go inside. Go inside, take a picture, tell us what it's like inside because we've always wondered." They said this entirely unironically. These people lived in this city their whole lives and never get access to the biggest building at the climax of their urban space. What an American concept. This exported American architectural imperialism may have started when American architect Daniel Burnham was hired by the U.S. government to design the newly occupied Philippine cities of Manila and Baguio with green spaces. This is to show how authoritarian, foreign, and ridiculous our building practices are here in the United States, and many people are completely unaware of the impact of it on the human psyche. These examples of the growing monumental designs of the early 20th century were a signal of the shift toward authoritarian design, largely influenced by models such as the Corbusian radiant designs. These monuments are often separated from city function and placed in large square blocks denoting order and predictability. These give people the idea of being disconnected from their history and not worthy of it. Urban planning isn't just about building things closer together. Think about the modern parking lot outside the Walmart and the behavior that most suburbanites exhibit. I notice this in myself in these areas, even today. Beware the lowly vagrant walking not in line with the designed driveways, but beelining through the cars to get to the store. Most domesticated individuals, well entrenched in suburban culture, will walk in line with the driveway rather than beeline, and will work to find the closest spot in line with the door in order to avoid this conflict. This is the impact of the immediate environment on the brain. The brain is the main organ in our heads which impact the way we act toward one another. Powered by the glucose converted from the food we eat, the brain processes senses and memories through the workings of electrical pulses between neurons. Sometimes a AA battery won't work on whatever device you're using because the voltage isn't enough to get the gate open and you need a 9-volt battery. So too does the brain operate in the same way to process senses and memories. The process of action potential moves information through the neurons, and these electrical waves are read by the brain in much the same way sound waves are read by your eardrum. In early processes of memory, sodium and potassium enter and exit the membranes of the neuron, causing a flux, or electrical signal of positive and negative, exiting and entering. The MMDA channel at the beginning is blocked by magnesium on the membrane, until so many positive ions enter the cell that it is finally pushed out. The new door allows for more flow, and also calcium can fit through and is introduced to the cell. The calcium intensifies the ability for existing gates to let in sodium and other ions with phosphorylation, and also creates other gates in the membrane, further increasing the intensity of the signal. From your senses, new information is distributed to the hippocampus and parietal lobe, which interprets the information, and distributed from there based on context. If there is no context, it is sent to the frontal lobe for memory retention. If no context is built to be able to integrate it into the memory array in the brain, it is lost. The stronger the signal, the stronger the memory. This is how experience causes strong emotions and behavior. The process known as long-term potentiation the strengthening of neural connections and synapses in the brain, is often ignored, and while acknowledged by neuroscientists, is often unused in explanations of phenomenon of behavior and psychology. There's a clear disconnect between psychology and neuroscience, a phenomenon I call social determinism. It's a lack of scientific method in the so-called social sciences, and has been noted by the likes of Steven Pinkner, Bruce Lipton, and other scientists. It is the reason I see the field of psychology as not a social science, but a social study, not in its potential, but as it stands. Terms such as narcissism are applied to people deemed as incapable of empathy, but a more accurate term could be insecurity, a term indicating both cause and effect. It is known that human cognition is conservative and preserves only to maintain pre-existing attitudes and beliefs as long as they keep you alive. It only modifies slightly the current cataloging system. This is the reason why outside culture and inside thoughts are often out of sync, but loosely adjusted to behavioral compliance in order to maintain minimal self-preservation within society and survive. Contact not only with surfaces, but people provides a gauge of public values for people to identify with. Every human being in their quest for survival is drawn to domesticate with the thoughts and behaviors of the people around them, and the neural connections in the brain builds what some psychologists call identity, but more accurately is simply the culmination of memories that form their everyday behavior and self-conceptualizations, formed from their interactions with people and the environment. As memories are made more and more common, they are fused into genetic code over time, which are applied to future human brains by default. It was found that human interactions with domesticated dogs release chemicals that have evolved in the brain during domestication of dogs, while interactions with their ancestors, wolves, don't. This is a clear indicator of how social integration affects our genes, chemical reactions, and behavior toward one another. A lot of this is caused through means of survival, and our propensity to clamor for social acceptance is the same. The function of emotion in the brain was created, I believe, not by solitary reactions in the environment, but by a biological movement toward getting together for survival. And just like the dog, our brains changed in reaction to social integration and the pressures of it. As the process of social integration got more complex, so too did our brains. And emotional impact not only came from social interactions directly with people, but from shared representations in the environment, writing, music, architecture, and of course, the whole entire habitat that we created. Our brains change with the habitat we create and change with our current needs. This is part of the reason why I believe Eastern cities are more nuanced than Western, and this nuance needs to be observed because it is a good indicator of patterns of human behavior. Confucian culture largely revolves around a set of societal notions, not only of compliance to observed human traits and needs, but the ethics of preserving an air of social harmony through understanding of the needs of people around them and preserving community. Whereas Western culture, founded largely on Christianity, teaching the ethic of self-absolvement, born in sin and all. We don't understand the reason why we behave the way we do, but absolving the self from the pressures and stresses of it is key to being able to observe and understand oneself and others. Individualists in Western culture embrace the concept of free will because of this, without understanding that free will doesn't really exist. You are always a chain to your environment and the brain, until you free yourself, of course. All of these ideals are largely misunderstood by larger populations as a whole, but still affecting the ways we behave individually or communally. Much like the effects of branding, the effect of culture has a larger impact on you than you might believe. You grew up observing your parents and people around you who did much the same. These cultures are passed down and only changed slightly over time. What people believe is often what is asserted the most over time, especially those who struggle to keep up with societal norms in such a disconnected environment. I believe the reason for this is the brain, and the more integrated an element becomes into the memory array, the more we relate it to ourselves. This might be the reason why people see themselves as more central to events than actuality, and why people think more individually about in-group members in the cross-race effect. In 2011, it was proven that the fusiform gyrus processes facial features in the brain. It's possible that the more times a facial feature is processed in the memory array, the more elements it gets wired to. This is a possible explanation for some of the phenomenon of racism we see in this increasingly globalized society. Studies showed that in explaining success and failure on a test, college students are more likely to explain others' poor performance in terms of ability rather than difficulty, but ascribe difficulty to causes of their own failures. People also ascribe more simplified personality traits to others than themselves. I think that this is the basis of what we call empathy. When an element is more related to ourselves in the memory array, we are more able to emotionally identify with it in ways we do with ourselves. I believe these dispositions are averted simply by being around people more. This is probably part of the cause of America's ambivalence toward absolute corporate takeover of the habitat, when it becomes ubiquitously represented in all around them and dogmatized through daily actions and interactions. But people still see the environment around them and form thoughts based on that, because they are always and constantly forced to interact with it. The cognitive dissonance created by the habitat results in what is perceived as a growing narcissism or insecurity of the American people. Dissonance has been acknowledged as a real phenomenon in psychology, but it is poorly understood how it works in the brain. It is theorized that when two similar avenues in the brain are evenly valued, it creates tension in the frontocentral part of the brain. It has been observed through experiments with MRI imaging that when people are put in this condition, the reasoning areas in the brain shut down during input and pleasurable emotional centers light up. Consonance restoration activity takes effect. This might be the reason why dissonant information is more difficult to process. People who are put in dissonant situations exhibit activity in aggression areas in the amygdala and perform tasks poorly while showing the same performance decrement as people with extreme thirst and hunger. This could be part of the reason why America's car-centric environment creates dissonance in humans when its dysfunction goes against their true natures. I believe some people can simply be too insecure to think rationally. As suburbanites became overly sheltered, their brains became more and more connected to their emotions. The brain is wired to the most relevant nodes to survival, and while the means to survival have become more social, it further relies on social or cultural cues via people and the environment to tell itself that it's okay. Culture is often irrational, and America's largely individualistic culture can tend to suppress any notion that there are common natures between us. I think suburbanites crave more attention from those around them as a gauge to rationalize the idea they are right with the culture. Those on the narcissism spectrum preserve any conceptualization of themselves that revolves around them maintaining only the highest social standing of those around them. This condition, I believe, is caused through past traumas and exacerbated by isolation. Domestication comes through self-actualization through the environment, social systems, and people around them. Boredom was evolved in the brain to bring motivation to explore and find new and easier ways to survival. People react in two different ways to boredom. Some activate the right frontal lobe, inducing anxiety and movement to find something in the surrounding area that will ground their catharsis. When nothing in the surrounding area is found, they are reduced to activating the left frontal lobe, the daydreaming area. The brain is a muscle of habit, and the left frontal lobe can be automatically wired after some time, and people will seek out fringe ideas to keep themselves occupied and ground their self-conceptualizations. When people don't get enough signal to actualize the idea that they are in good standing for survival, it can cause dissonance. This disposition is better assuaged through diverse functions and purposes which are pragmatic to the people and the system. This is the reason why the suburbs really do bring out the worst natures of people. Only when this disposition is satisfied can people have the mind power devoted to rational thought and understanding of the needs of others. The best ideas have been born out of the city, and there is a need for further cultural balance that can only come through reducing the isolation of America's human habitat. Tattoos, I believe, have become increasingly popular among newer generations, which came up in America's isolated suburban system. While in previous cultures, introduction to adulthood was grounded through practical means of survival, in today's environment, adulthood largely has come to be associated with the simple presenting of oneself as able to do the most nefarious things adults are able to do, and being able to avert the isolation of the suburb. While tattoos were seen as nefarious expression by previous generations, it was increasingly chased as a means of expression of adulthood. This only grew between generations because no other public gateway to adulthood stands in its place, especially in America's corporate suburban design. What messages do you think America's children are getting about survival from their parents and the habitat? It is clear that people need to study the science of human behavior, but this social determinism in today's social studies is a big part of the reason why the environment has become so ignored in explaining the social phenomenon we see today. If the authority figures are ignoring it, why should lay people consider it? It's interesting the cognitive dissonance created in American brains when the education system blindly celebrates the architecture of Frank Lloyd Wright without actually examining the implications of it. They cram Leaves of Grass half a dozen times down the throats of their students, but never give a single lesson in how to change a spark plug. In arguably the most car-centric nation on the planet. This is a clear indicator of a cultural problem and a deriding of not only urban culture and reality, but agrarian practicality in favor of suburban liberal arts culture. This relegates agrarians to ag programs and suburbanites to useless liberal arts while the urbanists decay. Rest assured, there is no thought being put into any of this. In bowling alone, sociologist Robert Putnam observed through comparing surveys of social interaction and economic activity that there was an increase in productivity in the early days of suburbanization, but a decrease in social capital. The increase in productivity made people more complacent in their survival, while a decrease in social interactions in the burbs, and thus a decrease in bridging social capital. This created the silo mentality we see today. There are ways that city areas can be designed or reworked to work with humans rather than cars. It was noted earlier that children who grew up in the small lawns of the streetcar suburbs were often shooed off of lawns to the streets. There being not many places to play on the streets, they were relegated to parks and schoolyards without any relatable function. There's only so many times a teenager can play on the swing set. This creates dangerous areas, not only because the parks become like prisons to them, but because they are badly placed and designed. Parks connected to the street and sidewalk are safer because they bring eyes from the surrounding area and surrounding functions. Parks that are separated from the city should be connected to some other unpublic function, such as a corporation or a large business, that can maintain them and keep eyes on them. Eyes on the streets might be the single most important thing to keeping streets safe and removing authoritarian police interactions from communities. Eyes, produced by presence of people at different times, creates more influential and productive members of society, putting less strain on centralized government. I think many suburbanites are too insecure for it, and many need to ask more questions. Today, an unclear demarcation of public versus private space in suburban design is much of the reason why challenging eyes on the lowly pedestrians produce a confused population. Questions of, why are you here? What is your purpose here? What are you going to do? The space creates this cognitive dissonance in individuals and puts them in an aggressive state. In Korea, there are ways that they clearly design the space to show that it is somebody's home, and they don't restrict people from walking there, but rather make it uninteresting to walk there unless there's a clear reason. People hold confidence in where they are going if they know that they have a reason. Korean residential areas are protected by tall brick fences around the houses, completely blocking out the area of the house while maintaining the grade of the pathway, giving the person walking the signal that it's okay for you to walk through. However, on roads that only lead to few residential dwellings, they make the road distinguishably narrower, giving the signal of restriction and less ability for escape, making a person who doesn't have a clear connection to that immediate environment of that small path not want to go there. This is what makes residential areas safe in an urban area, something that's not done anywhere in U.S. urban development, and the houses in Korea contain exactly the same space and amenities as U.S. housing at cheaper rates, closer to transit, and public function. You don't need to have a car. Privacy is a very precious thing in the city, and people hold it dearly to themselves. This is a human condition that is used in planning outside the United States, though it's not even considered by U.S. planners. The careful tension of ebb and flow of presence in certain areas can also bring about times of privacy in certain areas, such as a park at certain times of low traffic. This not only brings in the eyes of those looking for a quiet time on the bench, but makes them respect the area and want to protect it for themselves. The ebb and flow of tension of presence also stimulates the brain through its mystery. Mystery has been noted as a possible draw for neurons in the brain because the more it makes people question, the more signals flow to different parts of the brain. E equals mc squared is not only popular because of its simple representation, but also its basis on authoritative scientific assertion, coupling with the mystery of it. Many people don't know what it means, but the mystery of it stimulates the brain without causing any dissonance. This is why people are often drawn to the foreign ethos, often without a clear understanding of it. Everybody wants a piece of the foreign ethos to make themselves more relevant to society and to understand the mysteries of the universe. This is a result of the brain and our need for social standing for survival. Mystery can be created through permeability of the environment, with a clear draw of further function like coffee shops and things that people can discover to become a part of. This is why the overly predictable grid design, while great for cars, isn't good for pedestrians. There needs to be car-free zones spread throughout the city, not just in downtown, but everywhere, because it will make people more connected to the city. Weaving paths with diverse use give mystery and function for people to draw eyes on the city and brings people together, creating a sense of place. Furthermore, people are drawn to unique grades and landscapes such as a small hill in the park, cliffs, and natural enclosements such as caves. These are invaluable to creating places of mystery not only for children but for adults. Sense of place can be created by building enclosements which create vitality and important places within the city. One of the problems with American cities is how they exclude city climaxes, such as those with fantastic views, eateries or arcade areas, through separation within the suburbs or through expensive tourist traps. Areas such as waterfronts and views should be made public because when people get enough of it, they become less crowded and create an ebb and flow and people can enjoy on their own. Sense of place gives people a sense of belonging and makes them care for the places they are in. The uses that are put in certain areas need to bring out different people at different times, not just in the daytime. Residential is a use, but their eyes are not on the streets at all times. People who value the coffee shop will value the surrounding area. People who work at the store will value the area, and partiers at the local pub bring eyes as well. Primary uses are the ones that bring the most economic and social activity in an area, but they also draw certain secondary uses that need to be considered. Think about the courthouse and the secondary function it brings, such as bond sales, jails, and eventually the liquor stores. There need to be other uses that absorb uncheek uses to give people further function in the areas and bring eyes back on it. Use give people ideas of what place they have in certain areas, and a lack of it can give people the idea that they don't belong there, losing eyes on the streets. This is why the terribly planned downtowns of America don't work. Banks, insurance, and prestige offices destroy vitality because they only make use of what is already achieved, giving those who are trying to build their lives the impression that they are unable to compete. The charm of secondary use comes from its inspiring underdog quality, crazy ideas giving meaning to life. This is one of the reasons why Disney-fied downtowns of America don't work and only bring the rich. This, along with policies that restrict housing development around mixed-use areas in the U.S. and land assessment based on values of surrounding developments, keep people from participating in the community. Policies that restrict housing development in the U.S. cost us 9% of U.S. GDP per year. Land assessment was found to be the biggest cause of the housing crisis and not only forces duplication of use, ending secondary use that help people develop their communities. This destroys vitality and also raises housing prices, creating homelessness and economic crashes. It's part of the reason why there are more suburban jobs than cities, however lower paid and less skilled they are. People struggling in the suburbs sense this, and it creates aggression about their purpose, lowering their quality of service and productivity, as shown in psychological studies. Additionally, as also noted by Richard Florida, modern industry is no longer supported by the current landscape. Manufacturing jobs, once better accommodated in suburban and rural areas, have been moved overseas and are no longer available for most Americans. The new industries, creative industries such as web and app development and entertainment, are better accommodated in dense urban areas. This is why hubs were developed in places such as Silicon Valley and areas around Boston and New York. However, these areas are completely inaccessible to average people because of exclusivity and high cost. And this struggle between the city downtown and surrounding suburban development raises the question as to whether we need to have downtowns at all anymore. City downtowns, now called central business districts, are largely inaccessible to people because not only restriction of housing, but culture. Many people are in denial of this, but the fact is, you need to have a car to live in the U.S. If you are able to live without one, you are highly privileged. Speaking of which, the separation not only is evident in urban and suburban use, but in people. But one major reason behind the perpetuation may not be what people would think. Railroad tracks are often noted as a major border between segregated areas, but part of the reason they aren't often crossed is because they serve as borders. Borders are caused by physical impediments such as large buildings, like civic centers, formations in the landscape such as rivers or mountains, and can be averted with high population brought in by urban function. And this needs to be made further and deliberate, possibly through the use of car-free zones and bridges to bring permeability between neighborhoods. There's a difference between calling a developing area something like Progress Village and having a coffee shop that people can make use of. People don't go near borders because of the connotation of the border. Ending. Nothingness. If there is nothing interesting near them, and they are impassable, it gives the signal that one should not be there. When an area of the city lacks sidewalk life, the area becomes notably private and people become exceedingly choosy of who their contacts are. This creates turf culture. The concept of the neighborhood became more popular during suburbanization and is a big cause of turf culture, reducing bridging social capital and vitality, and this prevents other future domestication and business in the area. This kind of provincialism tears apart cities. Jane Jacobs noted that there is an innately feminine attribute to the domesticated suburb in its separation. One of the implications of overly domesticated suburbanization without street use and other human influence is the perpetuation of domesticated sexual roles in culture. This creates the standards and tension we see today, and toxic masculinity along with irrational fears of natural human behavior and misunderstanding of culture outside of suburban intentions and baby creation. Deliberate intolerance of human behavior creates the stigma of materialistic understanding and social determinism we see today. However, it has been shown through studies that continuous meeting of strangers, even if it's that guy on the street you see every day, and observance of much the same behaviors produces trust in individuals, regardless of whether or not you know their name. In a 1933 study by Richard Lapierre, 128 hotel and restaurant proprietors were contacted assessing their attitudes against Chinese being accepted as guests. 90% of them gave a hard no when contacted over the phone, but when a young couple came face to face with them, only 1 out of the 128 actually refused. Conceptions held in the brain are often disconnected from the realities of real-life survival and interaction, and can be changed with different experiences. But schools have become the only place where children gather their conceptions of public life, and the ending of urban avenues for identity building prevents access to other practical education, such as building social connections to other people and learning how to change a spark plug. More extracurricular involvement increases psychological resiliency in children because more social experience builds more connections in the brain, building awareness of more prospects. Pressure has been exerted on schools to replace the village with expensive extracurricular in schools, taking resources not only from city areas, but from book learning. This is a part of the reason why the education system in the U.S. deteriorated. It really does take a village to raise a child. A Judson Mills experiment on 6th graders testing whether they would cheat in a game or not showed that the strongest morals were created by those who were more prone to do the wrong, but who didn't do it. Rest assured one thing, more social interactions bring more of a chance of that. Tighter social areas bring about protection of reputation because of more chances of contact. When you see the same people every day, it becomes clearer through social channels in the brain that those are the people who should be acquiesced to, and this brings trust and reciprocity with those people. This deference toward corporate takeover of the American landscape has brought about real problems. Saskia Sassen estimated that by 2015, corporations have accumulated more than $1 trillion in urban real estate, making urban areas even less accessible to the American people. So what's the answer? Frankly, current planners who are aware need to be less afraid to admit that there's a problem and speak out. Taking lay people out of the habitat building makes it less of a habitat and more of a struggle. It's interesting to note how dysfunctional the planned car-centric environment is, even when planned for cars. Just look at the Texas highway system. This is because practical human use has been completely ignored in its development. Allowing more vernacular architecture is necessary because it is developed by people who have an instinctual understanding of their own needs. Developing architecture that is of practical necessity and use. Understanding people is what it means to be an urbanist. Understanding by watching people and studying them to understand why they do the things they do. And creating architecture that actually fits the needs of the people. Planners should be unafraid to ask questions and speak out about the problem. Restrictive architecture signals inhibition and brings about unnatural competition in the environment. If I can't thrive, why should they? By bringing out an environment that accommodates natural human behavior, people will become less aggressive towards it. This problem can't be fixed by one single oversimplified solution, such as more electric cars, but nuanced development of the habitat that serves people in both our cities and our small towns. Don't let the powerful take advantage of your natures for the sake of their pocketbooks. Denial is the heartbeat of America. The sooner planners and people admit there's a problem, the sooner there can be a solution.